What if the biggest economic experiment in human history was doomed before it even started? On January 1st, 1999, 11 countries did something no nation had ever done. They voluntarily gave up their own currency. Politicians celebrated, economists applauded, and a few quiet voices warned it would all come crashing down. Nobody listened. 25 years later, those warnings read like prophecy. Millions of people lost jobs, pensions, entire futures, not because of bad luck, but because of a flaw that was built in from the start. So who knew, and why did nobody stop it? Imagine you are handed the keys to a brand new car. Sleek, expensive, impressive. Every politician in the neighborhood is driving one. The brochure promises it'll make your roads safer, your commute faster, your life easier. So you get in, you drive off, and somewhere around mile 50 you realize the brakes don't work properly. And the guy who designed it knew. He just didn't tell you. That's a rough metaphor for what happened to 11 countries in Europe on January 1st, 1999. Because on that day, something happened that had never happened before in all of human history. 11 sovereign nations, with different languages, different cultures, completely different economic histories, voluntarily surrendered the most powerful economic tool a country possesses, their own currency. They gave it up willingly. They gave it up cheerfully. And they believed, genuinely believed, that this act would unite a continent, end centuries of war and rivalry, and forge an economic superpower capable of standing toe-to-toe with the United States. Politicians were ecstatic. Mainstream economists applauded. Citizens were told this was the future. Progress, prosperity, unity. But here's the thing that history tends to quietly bury. At the exact same moment the champagne was being poured and the ceremonies were being televised, a small group of economists was publishing warnings so precise, so specific, and so completely ignored that reading them today feels almost eerie. They weren't being pessimistic. They weren't being anti-European. They were pointing at the architectural blueprints and saying, "This building will fall." And they were right about nearly everything. 25 years later, every single structural flaw they identified has not only materialized, it has played out in the lives of millions of ordinary people across Southern Europe. So the question isn't just what went wrong with the euro. The real question is, how did so many smart people build something so obviously flawed? And why are the people who trusted the system most the ones who ended up paying for it? Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand why the euro was designed the way it was, you have to understand that it was never primarily an economic project. Not really. It was, at its core, a political one. And that distinction between political ambition and economic logic is what explains almost everything that followed. After two catastrophic world wars in the space of 30 years, European leaders were haunted by one question above all others. How do you stop this from happening again? Tens of millions of people had died. Cities had been reduced to ash, and the leaders who rebuilt post-war Europe became convinced that economic integration was the answer. If nations traded together, invested together, and ultimately shared a currency, the cost of going to war with your neighbors would become so enormous that conflict would become unthinkable. Shared money, shared fate. That was the theory. And to be fair, it wasn't entirely wrong. European integration did contribute to the longest sustained period of peace in European history. The project worked, at least at the political level. But somewhere along the way, the political ambition overtook the economic engineering. Leaders stopped designing the euro around what would function, and started designing it around what would advance integration. And those are two very different design briefs. The result was a currency union with a flaw baked directly into its foundation. Not hidden, not subtle. A flaw that economists had been writing about for nearly 4 decades before the euro even launched. Back in 1961, nearly 40 years before the euro. A Canadian economist named Robert Mundell published a theory that would eventually win him the Nobel Prize. It's called the theory of optimal currency areas, and the argument is straightforward. A single currency only works smoothly if the economies sharing it are similar enough to live under the same monetary policy. You need labor that can move freely between regions when one economy is doing well and another isn't. You need wages flexible enough to absorb economic shocks, and critically, you need some kind of central fiscal authority, a shared treasury essentially that can move money from stronger regions to weaker ones when things go wrong. Think about how this works inside the United States. If the economy in Michigan collapses because the auto industry takes a hit, workers can relocate to Texas. The federal government automatically channels more spending into Michigan. Unemployment insurance, federal contracts, aid programs. and the Federal Reserve sets monetary policy for the whole country, while Washington manages the fiscal side. The adjustment mechanisms work. Europe had none of this in 1999, and still doesn't today. A Greek worker who loses his job doesn't simply pack up and move to Germany. Different language, different culture, different professional qualifications, different legal systems. The barriers are enormous and deeply human. European wages are protected by strong labor laws that prevent the rapid downward adjustment that helps economies absorb shocks. And there is no European treasury, no central fiscal authority with the power to tax Germans and send that money to struggling Greeks, the way Washington sends money from wealthy states to struggling ones. Mundell's conditions for a workable currency union were not met. Economists knew this. Politicians pressed forward anyway and labeled the critics as enemies of European unity. So what actually happened when the euro launched? In the early 2000s, interest rates across the Eurozone fell to historically low levels, set by the new European Central Bank based largely on what the German economy needed. And here's where things start to go seriously wrong. For Germany, those rates made sense. Germany had spent decades building a disciplined, export-driven economy with low inflation and strong productivity. Low interest rates were manageable. But for Spain, for Greece, for Portugal, for Ireland, these were countries that had historically paid much higher interest rates precisely because lenders considered their economies riskier. Suddenly, under the euro umbrella, those same countries could borrow at rates barely above Germany's. Spain could offer mortgages at 3% instead of 8%. Greece could issue government bonds at rates that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. Ireland's banks could borrow almost without limit at near zero cost. And they did. All of them. Because the money was cheap and the euro felt like a guarantee. It felt like Germany was co-signing the loan. What followed was entirely predictable in hindsight. Spain built a real estate bubble that in some respects dwarfed even America's housing collapse. Ireland's banking system ballooned to roughly 10 times the size of the entire Irish economy. Greece borrowed to fund a government that was spending something like 50% more than it was collecting in taxes. Portugal accumulated trade deficits year after year, making its economy structurally dependent on foreign capital just to function. And all of this happened under the comfortable illusion that euro membership meant these countries were too integrated, too important, too European to be allowed to fail. They were half right. They wouldn't be allowed to fail outright, but the price of being saved would be something no voter had agreed to and no politician had fully explained. Now here's where we need to talk about what is perhaps the most underappreciated flaw in the whole system. Before the euro existed, Southern European countries had a tool available to them when their economies hit trouble. It was called devaluation. And before you glaze over at the economics terminology, let me explain why it mattered so much. If Italy's economy was struggling, exports falling, unemployment rising, businesses closing, Italy could simply reduce the value of the Italian lira. A weaker lira meant Italian goods became cheaper for foreign buyers overnight. Italian tourism became more affordable. Italian wages, measured in international terms, fell, making Italian workers more competitive without anyone having to take an actual pay cut on paper. Yes, it made imports more expensive. Yes, it reduced purchasing power. But it gave the economy a pressure valve, a way to adjust without catastrophic social consequences. The euro eliminated that pressure valve entirely, and critically, it replaced it with nothing equivalent. When Greece's economy collapsed in 2010, Greece could not devalue. It was locked into a currency it no longer controlled. The only path back to economic competitiveness was what economists call internal devaluation, a phrase that sounds technical and neutral but describes something brutal in practice. Slashing wages, cutting pensions, gutting public services, deliberately creating mass unemployment and holding it there until costs fell enough to compete internationally again. It is, in plain English, deliberately inflicting economic pain on a population until the pain achieves what a currency adjustment would have achieved overnight. In Greece, this process was devastating in ways that statistics can barely capture. Unemployment hit 27% of the workforce. Among young people under 25, it exceeded 60%. Not for a quarter or a year, for years. An entire generation either couldn't find work or left the country. Doctors emigrated, engineers emigrated, businesses closed by the tens of thousands. Suicide rates rose measurably, and after nearly a decade of this treatment, after all that suffering, after all those sacrifices, Greece's total debt burden was actually larger than when the crisis began, because austerity shrank the economy so fast that the debt-to-GDP ratio kept climbing even as the government cut spending. The medicine was worse than the disease, and the patient had no choice but to keep taking it because leaving the euro, reintroducing a new currency, facing the immediate capital flight and financial chaos that would follow, was judged to be even more catastrophic. So Greece stayed and paid, and is still, to this day, dealing with the economic consequences of that decade. But the economic damage, as severe as it was, may not even be the most dangerous consequence of the euro's structural design, because there's a third flaw running beneath the surface, and it's political. The European Central Bank is not democratically accountable to the citizens whose lives it controls. Its governors are appointed, not elected. Its decisions cannot be reversed or overturned by any national parliament in Europe. Its core mandate, maintaining price stability, is written into European treaties that require unanimous agreement from every member state to change. It is, by design, insulated from democratic pressure. What this means in practice is that when the ECB raises interest rates to fight inflation in Germany, and that decision simultaneously crushes growth in Italy, no Italian voter can do anything meaningful about it. They cannot vote out the ECB president. They cannot elect a different monetary policy. They are governed by an institution they had no real voice in creating and have no real mechanism to change. They are, in the most fundamental sense, subjects of a monetary system rather than citizens of one. And this creates a specific kind of political toxicity that we have watched spread across Europe in slow motion over the past 15 years. When ECB decisions hurt ordinary people, and those people cannot hold the ECB accountable because it is deliberately designed to be unaccountable, they hold their national governments accountable instead. They vote for parties that promise to fight Brussels. They elect leaders who channel the rage at the system even when those leaders have no realistic plan for changing it. Look at Italy. For decades dominated by broadly pro-European centrist politics, now governed by parties that campaigned explicitly against the constraints the Eurozone imposes. Look at France, where politicians calling for France to reconsider Euro membership have consistently polled as among the most popular figures in the country. Look at Greece itself, where in 2015 a party called Syriza won a landslide election on an explicit platform of rejecting Eurozone austerity. They then spent 6 months in increasingly desperate negotiations with European creditors before surrendering almost completely. Because when you cannot leave a currency, you have almost no leverage in negotiations with the people who control it. The democratic deficit doesn't just produce bad economics, it produces dangerous politics. Because when people feel the system cannot be changed from within, they start looking for ways to break it from outside. There's one more piece of this story that tends to get quietly glossed over: what actually happened during the bailouts. When Greece's debt became unpayable in 2010, European leaders faced a genuine fork in the road. They could allow Greece to default, which would have caused massive losses for French and German banks that had been lending heavily to Greek bonds. Or they could organize a bailout, using taxpayer money from across Europe to cover the debt. They chose the bailout. But the way they structured it told you everything about whose interests were really being protected. The rescue packages were publicly framed as help for Greece. In practice, the money flowed almost immediately from European institutions through Greece and straight into the hands of French and German banks that held Greek debt. The banks got their money back. Greece got the austerity conditions. Greek citizens bore the consequences while the institutions whose reckless lending had helped inflate the problem were made whole on the back of European taxpayers. This same pattern, bailouts that were really bank rescues delivered through sovereign governments, repeated in Ireland, in Portugal, in Spain. What it amounted to was a system where financial institutions privatized the gains during the good years, then socialized the losses across entire populations when the bets went wrong, and the populations who paid the most were the ones with the least power to refuse. Now here's the part of this story that should make anyone stop and think. These flaws were not discovered after the crisis. They were not identified with hindsight. They were documented, published, and argued in public before the euro launched. In the 1990s, a group of German economists signed what came to be known as the Euro Manifesto, a public warning that the Eurozone was not ready, that it did not meet the basic conditions for a working currency union, that launching monetary union without fiscal union was not just premature but dangerous, and that the weaker economies would face catastrophic consequences when the first serious economic shock arrived. They were dismissed as pessimists, as obstructionists, as people who simply didn't understand the larger political vision. In the United States, Milton Friedman, not someone you'd normally associate with opposing free markets, predicted publicly that the euro would not survive its first serious recession. He argued that without the ability to devalue, Southern European nations would face unemployment severe enough to generate irresistible political pressure to exit. He was exactly right about the unemployment. He arguably underestimated how much political pain those nations would absorb rather than take the exit. Even inside European institutions themselves, internal analyses acknowledged the structural concerns. But the political momentum was by then unstoppable. Too many careers had been built on the project. Too much prestige had been staked. Too much political capital had been invested for anyone in power to pump the brakes. The warnings were noted, set aside, and the project moved forward. So where does that leave us now? Where does the euro go from here? There are roughly 3 scenarios worth taking seriously. The first is what you might call managed muddling. The ECB continues to intervene whenever a crisis threatens to become existential. Governments make incremental adjustments while avoiding the structural reforms that would actually fix the underlying problems. Debt levels continue climbing slowly in the weaker economies. Growth stays weak. Southern Europe stays stuck in a system calibrated for someone else, and the euro limps forward, always one serious shock away from a breaking point, but never quite breaking. This is essentially what has happened for the past 15 years. It can continue for quite some time. The question is whether it can continue forever. The second scenario is genuine structural reform. A real fiscal union, an actual European treasury with the democratic mandate and the financial power to collect taxes and transfer resources across the continent. A proper transfer mechanism that moves money from economically stronger regions to weaker ones during downturns, the way federal governments do in functioning currency unions. Genuine democratic accountability for monetary policy. This is what the euro actually requires to function as its architects claimed it would. It is also, at this moment in European politics, almost certainly impossible, because it would require German voters to accept a permanent system in which they subsidize Southern European economies, and German voters have shown no appetite for that. The political conversation needed to make it happen has barely begun. The third scenario is some form of breakup. A crisis severe enough or a political earthquake radical enough to force one or more countries out of the euro. Italy's debt continues growing. France's deficits continue expanding. The ECB is running out of the extraordinary tools it deployed in previous crises. And somewhere out there is a shock, a financial, political, geopolitical, large enough to finally snap the confidence that has held the system together. Nobody can say exactly when, but the mathematics of unresolved structural problems suggest it eventually becomes more likely than not. Here's the larger lesson that this story points toward, and it's not really just about Europe. Throughout history, every major monetary system has lasted only as long as it was anchored in something real. The gold standard worked for over a century because it was anchored in physical scarcity. There was only so much gold in the world, and that constraint was credible. The Bretton Woods system that governed the post-war world worked for a generation because it was anchored in American economic dominance. The dollar was backed by the largest, most productive economy on Earth. When those anchors weakened, when American gold reserves could no longer back the dollars in circulation, the system broke fairly quickly and fairly decisively. The euro is anchored in political will, in the belief that European leaders will, when it truly matters, always find a way to keep it together. That belief has held for 25 years. It may hold for 25 more. Political will is a real force. Anyone who watched Mario Draghi stand up in 2012 and say the ECB would do whatever it takes to save the euro, and watched markets immediately calm down, knows that political will can move markets and buy time. But political will is also the most fragile anchor imaginable. It depends on circumstances that can change overnight, on elections that can go in unexpected directions, on crises whose scale can overwhelm even the most determined response. When Rome's empire began contracting in its final centuries, the political will to hold it together was fierce. It held for a while through extraordinary effort, until it didn't. History doesn't repeat itself in neat patterns. But there is one thing it does consistently. It exposes the gap between how systems are sold and how they are built. The euro was sold as a project of unity and shared prosperity. It was built without the fiscal foundations that a shared currency requires to distribute that prosperity fairly. The people who designed it knew about the gap. The political momentum was too strong to stop, and the people who ultimately paid for that gap, who are still paying, were never the architects. They were the ordinary citizens of countries that trusted the system at its word. That is not ancient history. That is the story of the last 25 years. And depending on what happens next in Europe, it may also be the story of the next 25.